They signed the treaty in the Grand Hall of the Celestial Station, beneath stars that had witnessed 1,000 wars and would witness 1,000 more. Ambassador Chen's hand trembled as she placed humanity's seal upon the document, not from fear or relief, but from the weight of what she knew. What they all knew. The Valix delegation stood across the crystalline table, their 3 eyes gleaming with what they believed was triumph, their mandibles clicking in what their translators rendered as satisfaction. They thought they had won. They thought humanity, bloodied and exhausted after 15 years of conflict, had finally broken. They thought the humans had believed their promises of lasting peace, of shared prosperity, of a new era where 2 species might walk among the stars as equals rather than enemies. But Ambassador Chen had read the reports. She had seen the intelligence briefings that arrived in encrypted files, stamped with classifications that made even admirals pale. She knew about the shipyards hidden in the Valix home system, the military production that had never slowed, the weapons development that continued even as their diplomats spoke of disarmament. She knew about the troop movements disguised as merchant convoys, the strategic positioning of fleets near neutral zones, the quiet annexation of buffer worlds whose populations had suddenly gone silent. Every human at that table knew. Every diplomat, every military observer, every translator and aide who had spent months in those negotiations knew that the peace they were signing was a fiction, a beautiful lie wrapped in the language of hope. The Valix had no intention of honoring this treaty. It was a weapon, as surely as any plasma cannon or fusion warhead. It was designed to buy them time, to lull humanity into complacency, to create the perfect moment for a strike that would end the human threat forever. And yet, Chen signed. Her hand moved across the light paper with practiced grace, her signature flowing in both English and Mandarin, a representation of the unified Earth that had emerged from the crucible of interstellar war. Behind her, Admiral Kowalski stood at attention, his dress uniform immaculate, his face carved from stone. He knew too. Every line in his weathered face spoke of the battles he had fought, the ships he had lost, the orders he had given that sent young men and women into the void knowing they might never return. He had held dying ensigns in his arms, had watched destroyers break apart under Valix bombardment, had made the calculations that turned human lives into acceptable losses in the algebra of survival. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that the Valix would strike again. The question had never been if. Only when. The other human delegates maintained their composure with admirable discipline. General Okafor's dark eyes never wavered from the Valix High Commander, reading every subtle shift in posture, every flicker of those alien eyes. Dar. Yamada, head of the Stellar Defense Research Division, kept her hands folded demurely, but Chen knew she was thinking of the projects hidden in facilities scattered across a dozen worlds, the contingencies that had been set in motion months ago, the preparations that would determine whether humanity survived the coming storm. They all played their parts beautifully, these representatives of a species that had learned, across 10,000 years of bloody history, that peace was often just war by other means. The Valix believed they understood humanity. They had studied Earth's history, analyzed human psychology, calculated human responses with the precision of their advanced computational systems. They had watched humans fracture into nation-states and corporations, had seen them squabble over resources and ideology, had concluded that humanity's greatest weakness was its inability to truly unite. They had predicted that the war would break the human spirit, that the casualties would breed defeatism, that eventually the politicians would override the generals and sue for peace on any terms. They had been right about the peace. They had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. The treaty ceremony concluded with all the pomp and circumstance that such moments demanded. There were speeches about new beginnings, about learning from the darkness of war, about building a future where both species might thrive. The Valix spoke of shared scientific endeavors and cultural exchange. The humans nodded and smiled and said appropriate things about reconciliation and mutual understanding. Holocams recorded everything for broadcast across both empires, creating the historical record of the day peace returned to this corner of the galaxy. Chen shook hands, or whatever the Valix equivalent was, with their chief negotiator. The alien's skin felt like warm leather, and its grip was stronger than it looked. Through the translator, it expressed hope that their children might grow up in a universe free from conflict. Chen responded with practiced sincerity, speaking of humanity's deep desire for peace, our willingness to forgive past grievances, our commitment to making this treaty work. Every word was true. Every word was a lie. Because humanity did want peace, desperately, with every fiber of its collective being. But humanity also wanted survival, and when those two desires came into conflict, the choice had always been clear. As the ceremony ended and the delegates began to file out, Chen caught Kowalski's eye. The admiral gave her the smallest of nods, a gesture so subtle that the Valix observers would never notice it. But Chen understood its meaning perfectly. The message had been sent. The pieces were in motion. The trap was set. Humanity had signed a peace treaty it knew was a lie, and in doing so, had committed itself to the most audacious gambit in its short but violent history among the stars. The Valix thought they were clever, thought they had deceived the naive humans, thought they had bought themselves the time they needed to prepare for the final war. They were right about one thing. Someone had definitely been deceived. The intelligence had started arriving 6 months before the first peace overture from the Valix. It came in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that dozens of analysts worked around the clock to assemble. A listening post near the Valix border detected unusual encrypted transmissions. A deep space probe captured images of construction in a supposedly demilitarized zone. A defector, one of the rare Valix who had developed something approaching sympathy for humanity, arrived at a diplomatic station with data chips hidden in a biological compartment that human doctors had to surgically extract. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture that made the Joint Chiefs lose sleep. The Valix were preparing for total war, the kind that ended with the complete extermination of the enemy. Not occupation. Not subjugation. Annihilation. They were building planet crackers, weapons that could shatter worlds. They were developing bioweapons specifically engineered to target human biochemistry. They were positioning fleets for a simultaneous strike on every major human colony, a decapitation blow that would destroy humanity's capacity for organized resistance in a single coordinated attack. The data was incontrovertible. The Valix intended to eliminate humanity from the galaxy, and they would do it under the cover of peace negotiations, at a moment when human fleets were standing down, when colonies were relaxing their defenses, when the psychological guard of an exhausted species was finally lowered. When the Valix first proposed peace talks, there had been celebration in the streets of Earth and her colonies. People genuinely believed the nightmare was ending. Politicians spoke of dividend from peace, of resources that could be redirected from military production to civilian needs. There was talk of reconstruction, of healing, of finally having the chance to grieve properly for those who had been lost. The intelligence community watched these celebrations with hearts full of sorrow, knowing what they could not yet reveal. The decision to accept the peace overture, knowing it was a trap, had been made at the highest levels of human government. It was perhaps the hardest decision any group of humans had ever been forced to make. To continue the war openly meant more death, more suffering, and quite possibly defeat. Humanity was exhausted. The industrial capacity was strained to breaking. The fleet had suffered losses that would take years to replace. Another major engagement might well be the last. But to accept the false peace, to play along with the Valix deception, bought something precious: time. Time to prepare. Time to adapt. Time to plan. The Valix expected humanity to demobilize, to let its guard down, to embrace the relief of peace so desperately that it would ignore warning signs. They did not understand that humanity had been playing the long game since before it reached the stars. Every human civilization had learned the same lesson, paid for in rivers of blood across thousands of years: trust, but verify. Hope for peace, but prepare for war. Extend the olive branch, but keep the sword sharp. So humanity signed the treaty and began what appeared to be a genuine demobilization. Fleets were recalled. Shipyards publicly converted to civilian production. Defense budgets were cut in theatrical displays before legislative bodies. Colonies relaxed visible security measures. Trade agreements were negotiated. Cultural exchanges were arranged. Every external signal suggested that humanity was doing exactly what the Valix expected, embracing peace with the naive enthusiasm of a species that had never learned the bitter lessons of realpolitik. But beneath the surface, in facilities that officially didn't exist, in programs hidden in the budgets of civilian agencies, in projects scattered across 100 worlds and disguised as everything from agricultural research to entertainment infrastructure, humanity prepared. The weapons programs that had been developing slowly during wartime were given unlimited resources and complete secrecy. Dr. Yamada's teams worked miracles. They had been studying Valix technology from salvaged wrecks, analyzing tactical patterns from 15 years of combat, modeling Valix strategic thinking with the help of artificial intelligence systems that had been trained on every bit of captured data. They knew how the Valix thought. They knew their strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses. The Valix were stronger than humans in direct combat. Their ships had better shields, their weapons hit harder, their tactical coordination was nearly flawless. But they were rigid thinkers, bound by doctrine and tradition. They valued elegance in strategy, finding disorder and improvisation distasteful. They believed there were rules to warfare, conventions that civilized species observed. Humanity had no such illusions. The shipyards that appeared to be producing civilian vessels were actually assembling a new class of warship, one built on principles that would have horrified the Valix. These ships weren't designed to win battles in the traditional sense. They were designed to fight dirty, to strike from impossible angles, to use tactics that the Valix would consider dishonorable. They carried weapons that violated every convention of civilized warfare, systems that humanity would never have deployed against an enemy it respected. But the Valix had forfeited respect when they chose genocide. The colonial defenses that seemed to be scaling down were actually being reconfigured, hardened, and hidden. Every major human world was being turned into a fortress, but one that didn't look like a fortress. The defensive systems were buried, dispersed, camouflaged as civilian infrastructure. Military units were being trained in guerrilla warfare, in resistance tactics, in how to fight when command and control broke down. Because the human strategists assumed the Valix first strike would be devastating. They planned to survive it and make the enemy pay for every inch of human space. Personnel were quietly being transferred. The best admirals, the most innovative tacticians, the soldiers with actual combat experience were being positioned where they would be needed. Families were being moved, though they didn't know why, their relocations disguised as economic opportunities or career advancement. Supplies were being stockpiled in locations the Valix didn't know existed. The human logistical network, already impressive, became something approaching miraculous as quartermasters figured out how to hide the movement of enough material to supply a major war while appearing to be conducting peaceful trade. And intelligence. Oh, the intelligence operations were a thing of beauty. Human operatives infiltrated Valix supply networks, planted surveillance devices in their shipyards, recruited sources who didn't even know they were sources. Every piece of data about Valix military dispositions, every detail of their attack plans, every element of their strategic thinking was collected, analyzed, and fed into the human command structure. The humans knew exactly what the Valix were planning because the Valix, so certain of their superiority, had become careless. They thought themselves so far above humanity that they didn't need to maintain the kind of operational security they would have used against an equal. It was a fatal mistake, though they didn't know it yet. Admiral Kowalski coordinated the military aspects with a skill that bordered on artistry. He had learned, across 4 decades of service, that war was ultimately about will. Technology mattered. Numbers mattered. Strategy and tactics mattered. But in the end, the side that refused to quit, that kept fighting when logic said they should surrender, that one more time when exhaustion said they couldn't, that was the side that won. And humanity, for all its flaws and divisions, had one quality that the Valix had never properly understood. When backed into a corner, when faced with extinction, when given the choice between fighting and dying or surrendering and dying, humanity chose to fight. Every single time. The peace held for 8 months. To external observers, it seemed to be working. Trade between human and Valix territories increased. Scientists from both species collaborated on neutral ground research stations. There were cultural festivals, art exchanges, even a small number of brave individuals who attempted to learn the other species' language without relying on translators. It was all very civilized, very hopeful, exactly the kind of peace that idealists had dreamed of. The news networks on Earth broadcast feel-good stories about former enemies becoming friends. Children in schools learned about Valix culture. There was genuine, honest-to-goodness optimism blooming across human space. Most people truly believed the war was over. The intelligence analysts knew better. They watched the Valix fleet movements with increasing concern. The patterns were clear if you knew what to look for. The Valix were positioning for a massive, coordinated strike. Their fleets were conducting exercises that just happened to position them near human space. Their supply lines were extending in ways that made no sense for peace but perfect sense for war. The timetable became clearer with each passing week. The Valix were planning to strike during the anniversary celebration of the treaty signing, a symbolism they apparently found satisfying. It would be a moment when human defenses were at their most relaxed, when the populations of major worlds would be gathered in public spaces for ceremonies and celebrations. The psychological impact would be devastating, crushing human morale just as thoroughly as the weapons crushed human cities. In facilities hidden across human space, the final preparations accelerated. The new weapon systems underwent final testing. Fleet units conducted exercises that looked like training but were actually rehearsals for very specific scenarios. Colonial defense forces ran drills that their participants thought were routine but were actually coordinated practice for surviving the initial assault. Yamada's research team completed their masterpiece, a weapon system so revolutionary that it would fundamentally change the balance of power between the species. It violated several laws of physics that most scientists had considered inviolable, but that was the nature of desperate innovation. When survival was at stake, humanity had a tendency to rewrite the rules. 3 weeks before the anniversary, Ambassador Chen received a coded message. The Valix had finalized their attack plan. The intelligence was detailed enough that human command knew which ships would strike which targets, what the order of battle would be, even what the Valix commanders expected human response to be. It was almost sad how predictable the Valix thought humans were. Admiral Kowalski convened an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs. In a secure facility buried 3 kilometers beneath the mountains of Colorado, the military leadership of humanity gathered to make their final preparations. The holographic display showed the entire human sphere, every major world, every fleet position, every strategic asset. Overlaid in red were the projected Valix attack vectors. It looked like a death sentence, 100 red arrows converging on blue worlds, overwhelming force against inadequate defenses. If the battle went as the Valix planned, humanity would be crippled in the first hour, defeated in the first day, extinct within a month. Kowalski stood before the assembled admirals and generals, men and women who had given their lives to keeping humanity alive. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He told them what they already knew, that the Valix were coming, that the peace had always been a lie, that everything they had worked for over the past 8 months was about to be tested. Then he told them something they didn't know. He told them about Prometheus. The name meant nothing at first, just another code designation in a war full of secret projects. But as Kowalski explained, as the technical specifications appeared in the holographic display, as the implications became clear, the room fell into stunned silence. Prometheus was a weapon, yes, but it was also a message. It was humanity saying that there were lines that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The Valix had chosen genocide. They had decided that humanity was a threat that needed to be eliminated, not defeated or contained, but erased from existence. In making that choice, they had released humanity from certain constraints. There were weapons that civilized species agreed never to use, technologies that were considered beyond the pale, tactics that violated the unwritten rules of warfare. Humanity had observed these conventions during the First War, even when losing, because they believed in maintaining their humanity even in conflict. But if the enemy sought not victory but extinction, if the war was truly one of survival, then the old rules no longer applied. Prometheus embodied this philosophy. It was elegant in its horror, a perfect counter to the Valix assumption of superiority. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity, but that was always when humanity was at its best. When logic said surrender, when reason said negotiate, when sanity said compromise, humanity looked at the impossible and decided to try anyway. The attack would come in 3 phases. First, let the Valix strike. Let them commit to their assault, let them believe their plan was working, let them send their fleets deep into human space for the killing blow they thought would end the war. The human defensive forces would fight, would bleed, would die in numbers that would haunt historians for centuries, but they would follow the plan. They would draw the Valix in, make them think they were winning, encourage them to commit everything to the attack. Second, when the Valix fleets were fully committed, scattered across a dozen systems and focused on their assault, Prometheus would activate. The details were technical, involving quantum mechanics and field theory that even most physicists didn't fully understand, but the result was simple. Every Valix ship, every Valix station, every Valix fleet element would suddenly find itself cut off from faster-than-light communication and travel. They would be isolated, each ship trapped in the system it occupied, unable to coordinate, unable to retreat, unable to call for help. For a species that valued order and coordination above all else, it would be psychologically devastating. Third, the human fleets that had been hiding, waiting, preparing in secret for 8 months would emerge from positions the Valix didn't know existed. They would attack not the Valix forces in human space, but the Valix home systems. Every major Valix world, every shipyard, every industrial center would be struck simultaneously by human forces employing weapons and tactics that the Valix had never imagined possible. The admirals listened to the plan with expressions ranging from awe to horror. General Okafor asked the question they were all thinking: wouldn't this make humanity as bad as the Valix? Weren't they planning the same genocidal strike they had condemned? Kowalski's response was measured but firm. No. The targets were military and industrial, not civilian populations. The goal was to destroy the Valix capacity to wage war, not to eliminate the Valix species. It was a distinction the Valix themselves had refused to make, but humanity would maintain it, would hold on to that difference even in the darkest hour. Because that was what made humans human. Not that they never descended into darkness, but that they tried, even when it cost them, to remain in the light. There would be tremendous civilian casualties regardless. War at this scale, with weapons this powerful, did not allow for surgical precision. Millions, perhaps billions of Valix would die. The human leadership accepted this with heavy hearts, but they accepted it. Because the alternative was the extinction of humanity, and that was simply not acceptable. Dr. Yamada had calculated the probabilities. If the plan worked, if Prometheus functioned as designed, if the human fleet executed its attacks with the skill and courage they had shown throughout the war, humanity had a 65% chance of survival. Not victory, survival. The Valix would be crippled, yes, but not destroyed. The war would continue, probably for years. But humanity would still exist, would still have a chance, would still have a future. Without the plan, human survival probability was less than 5%. The vote was unanimous. Every person in that room knew what they were authorizing, understood the moral weight of it, accepted their share of responsibility for what was about to happen. They voted to implement Prometheus, to let the Valix strike, to sacrifice the lives that would be lost in that first assault, to launch humanity's counterstrike, to change the nature of the war from human survival to mutual destruction. It was a decision that would be debated by historians and ethicists for as long as humanity existed, but in that moment, in that room, it was simply necessary. As the meeting ended, as admirals and generals departed to take up their positions for the coming battle, Kowalski remained behind with Ambassador Chen. She had been observing via secure link, maintaining her diplomatic duties even as she coordinated with military command. They sat in silence for a long moment, two people who had given everything to their species, who had made impossible choices and would live with those choices forever. Chen spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked if they were doing the right thing. Kowalski considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, then gave the only answer he could. He didn't know if it was right, but he knew it was necessary, and sometimes that had to be enough. Outside the facility, across human space, people continued their lives in blissful ignorance. They celebrated the peace, made plans for the future, fell in love and had children and dreamed of a tomorrow that would be better than today. And in hidden facilities, on ships positioned in deep space, in command centers buried beneath rock and ice, the defenders of humanity prepared for the day the peace would end and the real war would begin. The Valix struck at dawn on Earth, which was midday on Mars, evening on Europa, and deep night on the colonies in the Centauri system. The coordination was impressive, a testament to their strategic planning. Across 15 human worlds, Valix fleets emerged from faster-than-light travel with weapons already charging. They had positioned their forces perfectly, arriving simultaneously to prevent human fleets from reinforcing each other. The first strikes targeted communication arrays, command and control centers, anything that would allow the humans to coordinate a defense. In the opening seconds, hundreds of human facilities simply ceased to exist, vaporized by weapons that treated distance as a suggestion rather than a limitation. On Earth, the orbital defense stations held for almost 3 minutes before being overwhelmed. Debris rained down on the planet, burning meteors that had been human engineering and human lives. The planetary shields activated, but they were designed for smaller threats, defensive war rather than the apocalyptic bombardment the Valix were delivering. In cities across the planet, people looked up at skies turning red with destruction and realized that the peace had been a beautiful dream from which they were now violently awakening. Admiral Kowalski watched from the command center, his face a mask of controlled fury. Every report that came in represented lives lost, human lives, people who had believed they were safe. Part of him wanted to override the plan, to commit the hidden fleets now, to stop the slaughter. But he held his position, trusted in the strategy that he himself had approved, because responding too soon would doom them all. The human defensive forces fought with desperate courage. They had known this was coming, had prepared as best they could, but knowing did nothing to reduce the horror of experiencing it. Ship captains made the calculations that turned their vessels into missiles, ramming Valix dreadnoughts in suicide strikes that bought their colonies a few more minutes. Fighter pilots flew into combat knowing they wouldn't return, trying only to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. Ground-based defense forces fired everything they had at targets in orbit, knowing it was futile but refusing to die quietly. The Valix, for their part, were surprised at the intensity of human resistance. They had expected panic, chaos, rapid collapse. Instead, they found organized defensive positions, coordinated fire, and a willingness to die that their psychologists had not predicted. It slowed them down, made them commit more resources to each target than they had planned. Fleet commanders who had expected to secure their objectives in minutes found themselves in protracted battles that stretched into hours. It wasn't enough to stop the assault, but it was enough to disrupt their timetable, to force them to adapt, to make them extend their fleet positions just a bit more than they had intended. On Mars, the defense forces had prepared something special. The Valix fleet that emerged expecting an easy target instead found themselves in a minefield, thousands of autonomous weapons platforms that had been disguised as space debris and asteroids. The Valix lost a quarter of their assault force in the first 10 minutes, enough to turn their attack from an overwhelming strike into an actual battle. The remaining Valix ships pressed forward with admirable determination, but they had to be careful now, had to scan before advancing, had to coordinate their shields against threats from multiple angles. The human defenders made them pay for every kilometer of space, every minute of delay. Across human space, the pattern repeated. The Valix were winning, there was no question of that, but they were winning slower than planned, and in war, timing was everything. 3 hours into the assault, the Valix Grand Marshal received reports that made him uneasy. Human resistance was fiercer than anticipated. Casualties were higher than acceptable. Several target systems were behind schedule. Nothing critical yet, nothing that couldn't be overcome with determination and resources, but unexpected nonetheless. The Grand Marshal authorized the commitment of reserve forces, pulling ships from rear area security to reinforce the assault fleets. It was exactly what the human strategists had hoped he would do. 4 hours into the battle, as Valix ships across a dozen systems were fully engaged in assaulting human positions, Dr. Yamada pressed a button in a facility that officially didn't exist. The effects were not immediately visible. Prometheus was not a weapon in the traditional sense, not something that exploded or emitted radiation or destroyed physical matter. It was more subtle, more fundamental. Across the galaxy, in the quantum foam that underlay reality itself, carefully positioned devices activated and began to reshape the local spacetime metric. The mathematics were complex, the physics was barely understood even by those who had built it, but the result was simple: faster-than-light travel and communication became impossible within the affected regions. The Valix fleet elements, scattered across human space and deep in their attack runs, suddenly found themselves isolated. No communications with fleet command. No ability to coordinate with other elements. No retreat to faster-than-light speeds. Each ship, each fleet, was suddenly alone, cut off, trapped in whatever system they occupied. The psychological impact on the Valix was immediate and devastating. They were a species that valued order, hierarchy, coordination. They fought as they lived, in perfect synchronization with command authority. Suddenly being cut off from their command structure was like losing a limb, like having part of their mind suddenly go silent. Ship captains who had always relied on orders from above found themselves having to make independent decisions. Fleet commanders who had always coordinated with their peers found themselves fighting in isolation. It was a nightmare scenario they had never truly prepared for. The human defenders, who had been briefed on what Prometheus would do, recognized the moment of its activation by the way Valix tactical patterns suddenly became confused, disjointed. Ship captains who had been pulling back from losing battles suddenly rallied their forces, pressed attacks against enemy units that were no longer coordinating their defenses effectively. It was still a brutal fight, humans were still dying in horrifying numbers, but the momentum had shifted. The Valix were no longer executing a plan. They were surviving, reacting, trying to make sense of a battlefield that no longer followed the rules. And then, as the Valix forces in human space struggled to adapt to their new reality, the human counterstrike began. From positions in deep space, from hidden anchorages in asteroid fields and nebulae, from locations that the Valix had never discovered, human fleets emerged. These were not the forces the Valix had been fighting. These were fresh ships with full magazines and rested crews. These were the vessels that had been quietly built and positioned during the false peace, armed with weapons that the Valix had never encountered. Admiral Rodriguez commanded the strike fleet designated Hammer, 12 carriers and 40 destroyers that had been hiding in the Kuiper belt of a system the Valix thought was uninhabited. His orders were simple: proceed to the Valix secondary industrial world of Keleth and destroy its orbital infrastructure. Do not engage civilian targets unless they pose a direct military threat. Do not linger after objectives are achieved. Get in, hit hard, get out. His fleet made the jump to Keleth in perfect formation, emerging from faster-than-light travel at the outer system and immediately launching their attack run. The Valix garrison fleet at Keleth consisted of 8 heavy cruisers and perhaps 30 lighter vessels, more than enough to defend against any probe or raid, but woefully inadequate against a determined assault by superior forces. The battle lasted 17 minutes. Rodriguez's ships employed tactics that the Valix found incomprehensible, weapons that seemed to ignore their shield technology, and a willingness to accept casualties that made Valix commanders hesitate at critical moments. When the firing stopped, Keleth's orbital infrastructure was rubble, its shipyards were destroyed, and its defensive fleet was scattered debris. Rodriguez's fleet had taken casualties, 3 destroyers lost and damage across most of his other vessels, but they had achieved their objective. Across the Valix Empire, similar scenes played out as human strike fleets emerged from hiding and attacked targets that had been carefully selected to cripple Valix war-making capacity without necessarily destroying Valix civilization. Shipyards burned. Industrial centers went dark. Military command facilities were reduced to craters. The Valix home fleet, the massive force that had been held in reserve to defend against any human counterattack, found itself unable to respond effectively because Prometheus had cut off their faster-than-light capability. They could defend the immediate space around their homeworld, but they couldn't reach the other systems under attack. They could only watch, helpless, as the human fleets ravaged the Valix Empire. The war did not end in a day or a week. It ground on for another 14 months, brutal and bloody, both sides taking casualties that would have broken lesser species. But the nature of the conflict had fundamentally changed. The Valix had lost their advantage of coordination and superior position. Their fleets were scattered, isolated, unable to concentrate force effectively. The humans, having survived the initial onslaught and delivered their counterstrike, were now fighting with the grim determination of a species that knew it would never get another chance. There were battles that would be studied in military academies for centuries. There were heroic last stands and tactical brilliance and moments of cowardice and glory that defined both species. The Valix adapted, learned to fight without central coordination, developed new tactics suitable for independent operations. But they were always reacting, always responding to human initiative, always one step behind. Prometheus remained active for 8 months before Dr. Yamada's teams carefully began to dial it down, restoring faster-than-light capabilities in selected regions under controlled conditions. By then, the strategic situation had changed irrevocably. The Valix were exhausted, their industrial base crippled, their fleets scattered and demoralized. When they finally sent another peace offer, a real one this time, humanity was in a position to dictate terms. The second peace conference was held on a neutral station, but the atmosphere was completely different from the first. This time, there was no pretense of equality, no diplomatic niceties about mutual respect. The Valix delegations arrived as supplicants, asking for terms that would allow their civilization to survive. Ambassador Chen, older now by what felt like decades though it had only been 2 years, laid out humanity's demands. The terms were harsh but not genocidal. The Valix would surrender a third of their territory to serve as a buffer zone under neutral administration. They would submit to inspection regimes that would prevent them from rebuilding their military to threatening levels. They would pay reparations, though Chen was careful to structure these in ways that wouldn't completely destroy the Valix economy. War crimes tribunals would be established, and individuals responsible for targeting civilian populations would face justice. But the Valix species would survive. Their civilization would continue. They would have a future, albeit a diminished one. The Valix Grand Marshal, the same one who had ordered the genocidal attack, was notably absent. He had died in battle, or perhaps died by his own hand when he realized the magnitude of his failure. His replacement was younger, less certain, and most importantly, willing to listen. He asked Chen why humanity hadn't simply eliminated the Valix entirely. They had the capability now. The Valix fleets were broken. The human forces could have scoured every Valix world, could have paid back the attempted genocide with actual genocide. What had stopped them? Chen's response was quiet but firm. She said that humanity fought for survival, not extinction. That there was a difference between doing what was necessary and doing what was monstrous. That humanity had spent 10,000 years learning to be better than their worst instincts, and they would not abandon those lessons even in their darkest hour. She said that the Valix had made a choice to see humanity as vermin to be exterminated, but humanity chose to see the Valix as people who had made terrible decisions, and people could change. The Valix Grand Marshal's replacement looked at her with all three eyes, trying to understand this species that defied everything the Valix thought they knew about warfare and survival. He asked if the humans truly believed that peace was possible now, after everything that had happened. Chen admitted she didn't know. Trust had been shattered, probably beyond repair. The humans would remain vigilant for generations, perhaps forever. The Valix would live under the weight of what they had attempted, and that shame might poison them from within. But the alternative was mutual destruction, and even after all the blood and horror, neither species truly wanted that. So they would try. They would try because the alternative was unacceptable. The treaty was signed not in celebration but in somber recognition of what both species had lost and what they had nearly destroyed. There were no speeches about new beginnings or shared futures. Just a quiet acknowledgement that they had both looked into the abyss and barely stepped back. The human delegation returned to Earth 3 days later, and for the first time in years, Admiral Kowalski allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had done. The plan had worked. Humanity had survived. But the cost had been measured in millions of lives, human and Valix both. The moral compromises they had made would be debated forever. And Kowalski would carry the weight of every death, every sacrifice, every choice that had led to this moment, for the rest of his life. In the weeks and months that followed, as humanity began the long process of rebuilding, stories began to emerge about what had happened during those terrible days. The civilians who had fought with nothing but their bare hands and whatever tools they could find. The ship crews who had stayed at their posts as their vessels disintegrated around them. The children who had been evacuated to shelters and emerged to find their worlds transformed. The Valix prisoners of war who had been treated with dignity and care even as Valix forces were bombarding human cities. Every story reinforced the same lesson: humanity had survived not because they were stronger or more technologically advanced, but because they